In the far southwest of England, where a long stretch of land and a witch's finger reaches out into the wild sea, is Cornwall, a place of so much myth and legend and folklore. In this new ongoing series, we are going to be walking the moors and the woodlands and the shores of this utterly beautiful and mysterious county. It is home to mermaids and piskies, legends of kings and giants, of ghosts and many witches. Welcome to the wonderful land of Celtic Kernow. Cornwall. How many of us in the UK know this gorgeous place as a haven for sunny beach holidays? It's one of those places in Britain that as soon as you say its name, a picture is conjured up looking like a picture postcard. Maybe on this postcard will be a beach of golden sands, the sky the brightest blue, and the sea foam lapping at the shore and families resting, children and pets playing. Maybe it's a postcard of one of the majestic part-ruined engines from Cornwall's proud mining history, huge spire-like structures reaching out to touch the clouds as heather-strewn moorlands or wild, raging seas beat the rocks below, the memories of industry. Maybe the postcard you choose might show a tall sailing ship. Cornwall being a peninsula, it reaches far out into the sea, with many ports and pretty white villages spilling down to the smallest ancient small harbours. No wonder sea folklore, fishing folklore and piratical legends abound. Cornwall is a place of my childhood. Even my name is Cornish, Kelly. It means woodland grove. I think I must have spent more time in my childhood in Cornwall than anywhere else. My family love it hopelessly and fully. It's one of the family heart homes and is a deep part of my family history. As a child, I would avidly collect books about Cornish ghosts and myths and folklore, those little ones that you find in tourist information centres. And I think it's one of the things that probably led me on my course of being an artist and writer of British folklore. Cornwall, even in literature and popular media, has an otherworldly atmosphere. Maybe this is because it retains so much of its Celtic heritage, once ruled by the same tribe of ancient folk who inhabited Brittany in France, and Devon, the Dumnonii. Or maybe it's because it's so far west and poking into the sea. But even in classic horror films such as Hammer, Cornwall is a place that was used as the setting for strange tales, a place cast as wild, uncanny, eerie, unnatural and untamed, where just about absolutely anything could happen. And so, with this in mind, I am introducing a new series in the same vein as my Dartmoor series, and this will be focusing on the strange folklore of Cornwall. And we will walk its fields and climb its moorlands, stroll its beautiful villages, and explore its stunning coastline. I hope it will bring you not just a sense of the beauty of Cornwall, but also some of the magic and wonder of Kernow, and a little of the love that I have for this ancient Celtic land. For our very first story, of our very first episode of Cornish Folklore, we are going to a moorland area, a place that has filled the locals with fear and wonder since time immemorial. This is a haunting piece of land, and the wind sweeps over the grasses here, making the nearby rocky tor howl. It is an area sprinkled with ancient mysterious standing stones. The hilly place we are going to today is known as the Gump, and is found nearby the village of St Just, not too far away from the wild Cornish coast and the salty seas. The Gump. What a name! It is a place known for fairies and fairy dancing. And it was these dances that humans would respectfully watch, a time of peace and mutual friendship and help between both fairy and human neighbours. Now, in our modern times, where there is less respect for the good folk, and a lot of disbelief in fairies, We are the merry few who still might to this very day spy on these wonderful creatures and still see the revels. However, always remembering the golden rule, respect always, be quiet and secret, do not draw attention to yourself. Because as mesmerising as the fairy folk are, they also guard their world and territory jealously, and will not tolerate our human presence. Their wrath can be swift and dangerous, as one old fellow found out, although I have to say it was rather well deserved. And so to this fellow. He was a man of St. Just, who may still have family in the area to this day. Cornwall is like that, it's old and family roots live long here. He was known to all as a miserable, mean and grabbing man with a most dreadful reputation, and he was not liked by anyone at all. This mean old fellow had heard tales of the Faeries and the Pixies who lived in the area, and also of their incomparable wealth and treasure. He would listen to the stories with eyes squinting in the darkness and teeth grinding. Such was his greed and need for these riches for himself. His life would be nothing without this pixie fairy treasure. A plan began to form in his twisted mind. It was a clear night when he set off for the moorland and the Gump. A full moon shone down on the landscape, an eerie mimicry of that bright fair day. His plan was to carry out this theft alone, because no way would he even have considered inviting others and sharing. Not even a copper penny would be shared with anyone else. And so off he snuck on his adventure, creeping through St. Just, so as not to make a single noise. Once out of the village, his heart began to beat just that little bit faster, and a cold sweat began to roll down his spine. Fear had begun to slide around his imagination. Under the white moonlight and over the fields he stepped, the fear almost, but not quite, tempting him to simply turn around and run back home as fast as his bandy old legs could carry him. After quite some walking, he began to hear the delicate strains of music that drifted on the breeze towards him. He must be nearing the dancing grounds. Before much longer, the music was all around him, entrancingly beautiful, the most beautiful of melodies. And yet not a soul or a single thing was around. The Gump was as empty and desolate as always. In fact, the only living thing that was there was him. Now the music was to the left and to the right, from above and below, haunting and entrancing and tempting, and despite his miserable nature, he found himself starting to smile. A strange feeling starting to seep into him, something he was not used to. And then a slight snort, an unexpected snort of a laugh, unusual to his ears. The music slithered around him. He felt touched softly by it, so very beautiful, and he found now that he began to weep silently, despite also the feeling of comfort and warmth and amusement and sheer joy. And now his foot started to lift on its own, the toes on the other foot tapping softly, and the heel of the first foot rising and kicking forwards. And before long the old miser was crying and laughing and dancing to a rhythm that was sublime. He simply could not help himself. Now, you would think that with all this new emotion he would be a changed man. However, old dogs do not learn new tricks, or so it is said. And despite all of his jerking and tapping and swirling and laughing and crying, his mind was still fixed on the treasure. And oh my, he wanted that treasure. Now his feet had brought him tapping and clicking and dancing to the Gump itself, and suddenly all the music stopped with a deafening crash. The silence on the moonlit moorland now felt almost louder than the music by comparison. As the old man stood stock still and trembling, the whole hillside now changed, as though life was rushing through it and into it and out of it and beyond. The atmosphere shimmered and now thousands of tiny star-like lights began to appear all over and around. In every colour of the rainbow, silvery lights dotted the foliage of the gorse. Minuscule lamps hung pendant from the stooping grasses. It was quite frankly magical. The hillside began to open, and from the earth came a troop of what the locals knew as spriggins, small in stature and marking with great purpose. The good folk whose homes were the rocks and the stones, creatures of mischief and naughtiness, thieves by nature, and quite dangerous to those humans who would in turn be thieves themselves. But the old man had never paid any heed to this particular part of the folklore. Following the spriggins came from the hill musicians, and then small soldiers carrying banners and pennants that fluttered with a spectral breeze, although in reality there was not a breath of wind at all. The musicians led the spriggins and the soldiers and all the fairy and pixie creatures in a circle, all around the Gump, seemingly completely oblivious to the old man. Now they were a complete ring, and the man was surrounded. Although he wasn't so bothered really, the creatures were all so tiny, he felt they would be easy to overcome, to snap and break and squash, should he need to make a fast getaway. Once the first hill dwellers had formed their ring, another group of fairy folk emerged from the hill, and these seemed to be servants of some kind, carrying the most sparkling gold and silver goblets, and jugs and crystal decanters. These were scattered with rubies and emeralds and diamonds so bright that the old man could see them, even from where he stood. Following the servants came more folk, with platters piled high with meats and pastries, rich fruits and jellies and jams. The whole scene was full of sights that the old man, and probably ourselves, would find awe-inspiring. The servants slipped away silently and efficiently, and the old miser's fingers grasped the thin air as he imagined reaching out to take some of the food or grab one of the bejewelled goblets. Just as he was thinking nothing could impress him more in his life, a sight appeared that was so incredible that it seemed a miracle. From the hill came a host of finely dressed noble gentlefolk, fairy males and fairy females, lit from within with a light that no human could describe, dressed in clothes of the finest silks and velvets and satins. Every nobleman escorted a lady, and 2 by 2 they descended from the hill. The nobles came in great number and in groups. The first group of gentlemen were dressed all in primrose yellow, satin decorated with copper. Their helmets were copper too, with sunshine yellow feathers. Yellow shoes with copper heels finished the whole ensemble. Their ladies were dressed all in sparkling white satin with turquoise edges. Their tiny feet were clad in the palest blue shoes, with a single turquoise for each buckle surrounded by pearls. The gentlemen led the ladies to their places and stepped back a little, ready for the next arrivals at the dance. And now the second group, the gentlemen in black velvets trimmed in silver with silver helmets and black feathers. The outfits were finished with coal-black stockings and silver shimmering shoes. The ladies who accompanied these gentlefolk were in rose pink with gold embroidery, and pink feathers waved softly in their hair. Golden buckles in deeper pink were their dancing shoes. And then the next troop of fairy folk, and in these the men all were attired in forget-me-not blue and snow white, and the ladies in spring green, and diamonds scattered around the hems, and even more diamonds sparkled in their hair and on necklaces. These ladies had deep green shoes with a single diamond on each foot that flashed with white fire. And after these fine folk came even more and even more, all the colours of nature. But the last of the trooping fairies, they were the most sublime of all, the loveliest of all. Each lady had dark hair and was dressed in velvet white as snow, The linings were lavender silks, the skirt hems were the down of the purest white swan feathers, the bodices also trimmed with this floating cloud. Each lady wore a tiny cape of violet fabric, edged with even more swan's down. Each also had a tiara or a crown of silver with amethysts. Amethyst draped their throats, and over the bodices each carried a branch of flowering wisteria. Their gentlemen were clad in shimmering white too, and fresh green, and they each had silver rods with emerald stars. As the last of the court stepped onto the Gump, the music began once more, that same sweet, enchanting music, and with each note the old man's vision grew keener. He began to see with almost fairy sight how incredible this vision actually was. And his eyesight and his scent became that infused with fairy magic. When all the music reached a pitch, the ladies began to sing in a strange language, a sound as if flowers opening could breathe forth musical notes, so beautiful that tears would spring into any one of our eyes. It became obvious that the singing heralded the coming of something or someone quite important. As the melody filled the air, the hill opened once more, and very small beings came forth. These were first little girls, pretty as a picture in drifting gauzy clothes, scattering petals and flowers, and as these hit the ground they sprang into life, new flowers, beating forth more petals and more and more and more flowers. Next, a host of sweet little boys, with harps created from shells, making beautiful music. Then tiny men dressed all in green and gold and bearing banners, so many it was as if there was a forest accompanying them, and the flags waved elegantly to their own breeze. And finally came a raised platform carried high, with silk embroidery and golden threads trimmed in crystal. Carried on the platform were the two royals, a prince and a princess. Beautiful beyond compare, so beautiful in fact that it hurt even the old man's eyes. The princess's hair flowed to the floor, golden and shimmering, and in one hand she held a golden sceptre with a huge diamond. To mirror her, the prince held a sceptre to match, but with an equal sapphire. At the highest part of the Gump the platform was set down, now covered in a carpet of flowers. Each fairy now took time to come to the platform and curtsy and bow, and everything was perfectly choreographed. Finally, everyone was seated. The prince waved a hand, and now servants came forward with all the jewelled goblets of wine and the tiny golden dishes. Once the royals began to eat, all of the company followed, and they took food and they took drink. Not once did they acknowledge that the old man was hiding in plain sight. And now the old rogue decided to make his play for a trophy. If he could just reach up to the prince's table, he could steal enough to make him the richest of all of his parish and far, far beyond. He crouched down as small as possible and dragged his old carcass quietly closer and closer to the table. He was quite sure not one pair of fairy eyes had seen him. However, what the old fool did not know is that the spriggins had silently tied ropes to him and were holding the ends. As he slid himself closer and closer to the prince, he took a quick look around and behind himself to see where he could make a run for after stealing his prizes. Strangely though, when he looked back, he could see nothing there but blackness. However, surely it must be because the fairy lights were so bright that he couldn't see properly. Now he had seen a clear path. He turned his eyes back to the table and his goal, and every single pair of eyes, thousands of pairs of fairy eyes, were looking right at him, and right into his own human, beady eyes. But they did nothing. He convinced himself that they still could not see him. They were just happened to be looking in his direction, not actually at him, just in his direction. He steeled himself and crept close enough to make a move. He lifted his hat from his head and prepared to swipe some treasure into it. Basically, steal the prince and the princess table and everything that was on it in one go. And as his hand swept down, there came a whistle, shrill and piercing. One single whistle. The old man's hand was paralysed, stuck in mid-air, and one by one every light blinked out. A night black as pitch surrounded him. But the sound, the buzzing like a billion bees flying by him left and right. He wanted to move quite desperately, but he was stuck to the ground, pinned there by something invisible. And now began the pinching and the pricking, from head to toe, turning him black and blue, tiny stabs and vicious bites. He was pinned to the earth on his back, arms outstretched, legs stiffly held flat and straight. Even his tongue had been tied still so he could not utter a sound. Now he felt the rushing of a pair of tiny feet run up and over him and over his body. Whatever it was came closer and closer to his face until it stopped and stood on his nose. And now he could see it was a spriggan, and his heart sank, as suddenly he remembered all the stories of their cruelty that he had scoffed at, and he knew he could do nothing. The tiny creature jumped up and down on his nose, kicked it, stomped on it, stamped on it, and at the old man's fear and pain the spriggan only laughed. This was great sport to a spriggan. At last, after a good kicking, the spriggan reached up high on its toes and shouted in a shrill voice, "Away, away, I smell the day!" And off he flew, along with all of the spriggans that had stayed there. And now the man was left alone. Alone on the moor he lay there. His senses were exhausted. He was done. His body was finished. He was still terrified, and nobody knew that he was there. He could die there of exposure alone on the moor. He lay in the darkness, waiting for the cool light of dawn. The first rays of sun started to shine over the hills, and now he found he could slightly move his eyes, and all around him were droplets of dew starting to sparkle like diamonds, just like the diamonds that he coveted so much the night before. This was his reward, bloody dewdrop diamonds. At this realization, his bonds broke, and he turned his body over onto the damp earth and beat the ground with clenched fists and wet hot tears of shame, despair, fury and embarrassment, so many emotions. Sniffing at last, he crept to his feet, because if people came to look for him, he would have to explain why he had gone missing, and what could he say? He would be a complete laughingstock if he told the truth or lied, and he would be scorned forever. He brushed the worst of the dirt off his shabby clothes and hat. His body and his joints were aching dreadfully. And so, making his way home slowly and carefully and feeling each bite and pinch and prick with every step he travelled. And with each step too he began to feel more shame, and just how stupid he was. Much time later, the years found him a changed man. His experience and emotions had actually made him a better person. His greed was his greatest shame, and he had become a generous and kind soul. And over the years too, the old man had told a little of his story and then a little more until all of the tale was told. And we know it must be true because the old man was a simple soul and was not a man for making up tales. And this is how we know the tale to this day. If we travel almost as far as we can along the length of Cornwall, the land jutting out into the wild seas, we can find a strange shape of land looking like a witch's finger poking out into the Celtic Sea. This is a strange place. Many years ago we honeymooned here and spent our time discovering ancient standing stones and Iron Age settlements with our dogs. The land here feels witchery and haunted, full of stories and mysteries. And it was here a ways back in the mists of time there lived an old lady, Betty Trenoworth she was called, known as a mysterious woman, uncanny, and the locals began to speak of her as a witch. Now, as we know, witches were usually the marginalised or those who were a little bit of a burden on society, needing some extra charity from the parish, or they may have been those good souls who knew the ways of herbal healing, of talismans and sympathetic magic. Betty Trenoworth was one of these people, but the folk around her regarded her with more caution and fear, because they believed that Betty practised the darker magical arts. It's understandable, really, I suppose. A strange old woman living alone at a time of great fear of witches. Mob mentality at a time of poverty, hardship and struggle. People seem to need someone else to blame, and sadly this is usually those who are more vulnerable rather than those who hold all the power. Now, Betty had an enemy in one of her neighbours, and he had spread the rumours that she was practising black magic. The fearful villagers listened and remembered this, especially when one of the villagers began to have a run of bad luck. His cattle became sick first, then his crops failed, and nothing would go right for him and his family. Remembering the caution of Betty's enemy, his eyes looked in the direction of her humble home. This has got to be witchcraft, he thought, and that bloody Betty Trenoworth was the witch. The man and his wife and an accomplice decided together that she must be punished, persuaded to lift the curse that she had apparently placed upon them, and so in a strange act which in itself smacks of witchcraft, he created a doll from clay or flour and water dough. Into this doll, as he moulded the face and body with his rough fingers, he concentrated all the intention that this represented Betty Trenoworth. Once it was finished, he took a long piece of wood fashioned into a skewer and speared the doll up the lower part of its body. But how could they know if this had worked? Well, the accomplice had travelled to Betty's cottage, knowing the time the piercing would be done, and this fellow watched as Betty fell to the floor, writhing in agony. Betty kicked and cried out in pain, and finally in desperation shouted what on earth was this pain. She begged the witness to run to the farmer Dick Angwin's farm and tell him she'd make everything right between them all. The man ran back to the Angwin farm and told them of everything he had seen, and now the skewer was removed before too much damage could be done to the old woman, and they ended up stuck with the curse. A deal was struck between them all, and the Angwin family became content once more. And was this the end of Betty's spite? Nope, not at all. Her own cousin bore the brunt of her witchery ways next. It was after harvest on a Thursday market day that Betty Trenoworth walked all the way to Penzance. Her intention was to buy a pig, to fatten and bring on for meat during the winter. And Betty found a pig that she liked the look of best, and she haggled mercilessly with the owner, to the point that they were arguing over mere pennies. She just would not give way, stubborn as she was, and so she walked away from the deal. Her aim was to trick the farmer, of course, into taking her price. However, once her back was turned and she had wandered off a little way, her cousin Tom Trenoworth, who had been listening to all of this, approached the farmer and offered a little more than Betty for the sow, and the two men shook hands. Just after this, Betty returned to pay the price the farmer had asked for, and was shocked to find that her cousin Tom was now the owner of the pig. Betty was livid. However, she would just not have it. Tom must give her the sow for the money that she had wanted to pay, and Tom just laughed and shook his head at Betty was up to her old tricks again, typical of Betty. As he walked away, Betty threw curses at his back. He would be sorry that he had taken her pig. Once back at his cottage, Tom made the sow comfortable in the sty. He gave her fresh water and good food and locked the door safely behind him. The next morning, Tom rose early to check on the pig and see how she was settling in. When he got to the sty, though, the door was wide open. The food had not even been touched, and the pig had made its way to Tom's neighbour's garden, where it was rooting up all of the neighbour's vegetables and plants. It took a good number of the villagers to round up the sow and herd her back to her home. This time Tom double-checked the door lock and scratched his head. He mustn't have closed it properly, it was the only thing. He paid some money to his neighbour in compensation for the damage, and all was well between everyone once more. But this wasn't the end for poor Tom. Every night that door would be opened and the pig had wandered off, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. She even managed to travel some miles overnight. Honestly, the pig ended up all over the area in her wanderings, and every time Tom had to make good the damage done by this adventurous pig. Tom gave his pig the best that he could, the best corn, the best milk, meal, fresh vegetables, and even though she ate all and asked for more, this pig did not gain any weight at all. On the contrary, it became a thin and lanky thing. Between the nightly wanderings and the lack of weight gain, Tom was in despair, but he determined to carry on and try and look after the pig as best as he could. Months went on this way, and then one day who should come to Tom on her own travels but Cousin Betty the witch. She leaned on the wall of the pigsty and asked after the pig. How was the sow? Was she eating well and getting fat as fat could be, ready for winter? She told him she had heard rumours that it was a troublesome animal indeed, wandering around, escaping, causing damage and looking quite pathetic and thin really. She sucked at her teeth and looked off into the distance. Would he consider selling it to her? She could take this troublesome beast off his hands for a fair price, and save him any more trouble with the sow and his neighbours. But Tom was wise to the ways of Cousin Betty, and he knew she had a hand in this, and he would not give her the satisfaction of a crooked win. No, he told her, if the pig did not improve, he would take her back to Penzance and sell her cheap. Cheaper than he paid in the first place, because there was no way on God's green earth he was going to sell that pig to Betty Treneworth, spiteful woman as she was. Now, more time passed, more months, and in this long time Betty had approached Tom every now and then with an offer of relieving him of his burdensome pig, which by now looked in a pretty bad way, and was still escaping and still causing havoc. However, each time, to belittle Tom, she offered just that little bit less, and that little bit less for the skinny pig. But no, the answer was still definitely not selling to Betty. It came a time when Tom, he just couldn't take it any longer. The pig would have to go. It was costing him a fortune in compensation and reparations, and in food. He tied a rope to her, and on the soonest Thursday market began to trudge his way to Penzance. The sow trotted along quite happily, on her rope by Tom. He looked at her and couldn't believe that this was the same animal. And they travelled quite well this way until they came to a little stream that ran across the road at a place called Begowan Bottom. At this time there was no bridge crossing the stream, but a shallow ford to pass over the water. No matter what Tom did, his pig would not pass through this shallow water. He even held her back trotters in his hands and tried to walk her across in this way, like a wheelbarrow, and then tried to drag her, but she would not touch the water with her little trotters. And then she got away from him, tripped him in the water and bolted for the hills. Tom scrambled to his feet, soaked through to the skin, and he took chase. He ran after this very nippy pig, through fields, over hedges, down ditches, through scratching gorse thickets and through muddy bogs, miles upon miles. Finally they reached a proper lane, Lee Lanes as it was called, where it reached the long road to Penzance. Tom was exhausted. His clothes by now were ripped to shreds and he was covered in filth and sweat. The pig, though, was perfectly fine. As Tom and the sow reached close to Tregonabris, he managed to catch hold of the rope and together they carried on. Tom determined now to make it to market even if it was late. He had only just finished telling this to the pig when a hare leaped from the bushes by the road and squeaked a strange squeak. And then the hare shot over the moorland. And at this the pig took to her heels once again. And that pig, oh wow, she could run, almost as fast as the hare. Tom barely managed to hold the rope and keep up with the pig, but he gave it his all. At Tregonabris Bridge, a low-lying bridge with just a ditch running underneath, the pig veered off and scrambled into the ditch and right under the bridge. It was so low that Tom couldn't even crawl in to retrieve the pig, but still he held on to that rope. By now, though, the rope was cutting into his wrists and he was afraid it might sever his hand. He fumbled in his pocket with his other hand and reached for his pocket knife. At last he managed to manoeuvre himself to a position where he could cut the rope and free his hand. And at this, the pig shot forwards to the middle of under the bridge and then fell flat on her belly in the shallow water. And the poor animal, she simply lay there. Nothing would get her to move now. Nothing that Tom did at all. She just lay there. As the middle of day approached, Tom began to feel hungry, thirsty, and he was absolutely tired out. But he daren't leave the bridge to beg for some food and water at one of the nearby farms, or the pig might shoot off again and heaven knows where it might end up. He decided miserably to just sit there and rest and hoped somebody would pass by who could help him on the road to Penzance. It was really not Tom's day, though. Not a soul passed him, until just before sunset he saw a figure approach from the direction of Tregonabris, and his heart sank. It was Cousin Betty, of all the people, her basket flung gaily over her arm, knitting a stocking as she walked. Betty sidled up to Tom with a voice as innocent as sweet as honey, and asked if he was on the way back from selling the pig at market, and maybe he was a little tipsy after celebrating at the inn after getting a good price. Tom eyed her with a look of defeat and exasperation. He looked at his cousin and told her she knew full well that the pig was under the bridge, and she caused all of this by using her magic in her shape of a hare. The pig, she knew, would not go one way or the other. Betty put her knitting in her basket and looked at him coyly and ever so slyly. Of course, she sympathised with his great misfortune. She didn't really want the pig now, but, well, he was her cousin. She would take it from him and all the problems that went along with the pig as well. And to show how much she cared about her cousin, she would even pay him half of the price that Tom originally paid. I mean, look at the state of the poor pig. He made a deal. She would give him any food she had in her basket and the money she had offered a while back, and it would be done. Betty stood firm, though. No, she would pay no more than half of Tom's original cost. And with this, she took a fresh baked loaf from her basket. And now Tom was finished. The smell of the bread was just too tempting. Fine, he accepted her terms and be done with it. Be done with the whole mess. Betty had won. And Betty smiled. She made her way to the arch of the bridge and called that same strange squeak the hare had made all those hours ago, and the pig stood up and trotted gently towards her. Tom could only watch speechless as the pig trotted off along the road with Betty like a pet lapdog. A defeated Tom took the road to Sancreed, as we call it now, to find the pub there, the bird in hand, which much later became named Glebe Farm. He decided to stay at the pub until he ran out of money. Superstition told him that should he take Betty's money home, then 9 times the amount would be lost to him over time. It was, after all, the devil's own money. Once at the pub he told everyone who would listen the strange tale, and all there agreed he had done the right thing to get rid of the pig and Betty. And Betty was definitely that witchery hare. And Betty and the pig? Well, how did that end? Well, as you can imagine, the sow became fat and happy at Betty's cottage and bore many healthy piglets over many years. And the pig made Betty quite a lot of money over the time. And so, dear friends, thank you so much for joining me on this journey to our beloved Cornwall. Of course, there will be more and some things happening later this year that will mean some different content that will involve all of the things that we love, and also a fair amount of art, our own art, but more of that in the future. For now, dear friends, welcome or welcome back to Cornwall. Please do join me again on some more Cornish folklore adventures. We will have a fine old time among the piskies, witches, mermaids and fairies, with caution, of course. Always with caution. And so, dear friends, thank you so much for supporting our folkloric adventures so far. Please do subscribe and tell your pals who love folklore and fairies about us, and join us again. So until next time, dear friends, take care, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.